So our topic is friction. As before we discuss about the four cases of the elastic collision. After that we are having topic that is a friction. Now what is friction? For example, if we take an example of the Newton's law. According to the Newton's law, according to the Newton's law, suppose that this is a bicycle, right? This is a bicycle. This is a bicycle moving on the surface. This is a bicycle moving on the surface with the constant velocity. It is moving on the surface with a constant velocity, and after some time it comes in a rest. After some time it comes in a rest. It comes in a rest. But according to the Newton's law, as we have discussed before, that if a body is moving with a constant velocity, then some external force applied to change its position into the rest. As we all know that in first case of the laws of motion, we have discussed about that a body cannot change its position until some external force applied on it. So if it's moving in a constant velocity, how it's coming in a rest? So one scientist thought that there is some force that is stopping this, and this big bicycle come in the rest position. So that we can say that force is called the friction force. That called called the friction force that opposes the relative that opposes the relative motion of friction force. It opposes the motion of the relative force. So that is a friction force. Now basically the force, if we talk about the we can say the definition of the force, it is described as the force of friction. The force of friction is the force that develops at the surface of contact of two bodies, and opposes the relative motion What is it? The friction force is the force that develops at the surface of the contact. Right now, this is a surface, this is a surface, right? This is a surface, and this is a body. Here, this is a mass, and this is a surface, right? So the friction force is the force that develop at the surface of the contact. This is the surface of the contact at which two bodies of opposite the relative motion. These are two bodies. This is a surface and this is a body. So these are two bodies that opposing the relative motion. These are opposing the relative. So that is called the friction force. Now basically the friction force is classified on the two types. If we talk about the number one, that is the external friction. What is external friction? Basically the external friction arises when two bodies contact with each other, and or we can say try to move is an actual relative motion between two bodies. Or we can say the external friction is called contact force. Basically it is a contact force. As we discuss about the simple friction, here if we talk about the external friction, basically it is a contact force between two bodies that opposes the relative motion. If number two, if we talk about the internal Number 2, if we talk about the internal friction. If we talk about the internal friction, but in physics we usually discuss about the external friction, but that is classifies or also on the internal friction. Now what is internal friction? Basically which arises on the relative motion between every two layers of the liquid. Basically it depends on the liquid. Internal friction is dependent on the liquid, that is arise between the two layers of liquid. What type of liquid? We can say that honey or water, or we can say base. So these are the type of liquid. So the internal friction is also called as the viscosity. It also depends on the viscosity. It also called as the viscosity of the liquid. So basically the internal friction which arises in the relative motion between two layers of liquid, between two layers of liquid, it always arises on the two layers of liquid. So that is the internal friction. Now as I discussed that in physics we will always discuss about the external friction. So here in external friction we have three types. If we talk about the number 1, that is static friction, and number 2 is the limiting friction, and number 3 is the kinetic friction. First of all, we will discuss about the static friction. Here, what is basically static friction? What is the static friction? If we talk about the definition of the static friction, that is it is a force, or we can say it is opposing force. Opposing force is produced. It is produced when one body tends to move over the surface contact, but the actual motion yet not started. What does this mean? What does it mean by static friction? That it is opposing force. It produced when the body tends to move. Basically, static friction is discussing about the opposing of the tendency of the friction force. Before we discuss about only the opposing of the relative motion, here we will discuss about opposing of the tendency of the relative motion. So force is produced when the body tends to move. It is just started to move. It tends to move. It is not moving, but it tends to move over the surface contact. But the actual motion yet not started. But actual motion is not started. Or we can say that the friction force, the static friction force, which exactly balances the applied force during a stationary state of the body. Suppose that this is a surface and this is a mass of the 5 kg, right? And here normal reaction, we can say that normal force is the 10 Newton, right? The normal force is 10 Newton, and we can say that static friction is also the 10 Newton. So basically these both are balances each other, so that's why it is known as a static force. This body will not move because it's in a static friction. Why? Because the normal force and the static friction is both are the equal. So the body is in a static motion. It is in a static position, we can say. So suppose that we have applied the force of the 11 Newton, and the friction force is also, static friction is also the 11 Newton. These both will equal each other. If we apply the force of the 12 Newton, so the friction force, we can say static friction is also the 12 Newton. So basically these both we can say possesses static friction, that these both are equal. Basically, the value of the static friction is always variable. It changes with the surrounding. The value of the static friction is always the variable. But if we talk about the maximum value of a static friction, that is denoted as Fs maximum, the maximum value of static friction, we can find that here's the static friction maximum value of, we cannot find the value of static friction because it's a variable, but we can find the maximum value of formula for finding the maximum value of static friction, that static friction maximum value is directly proportional to the we can say the normal force here we applied. So we can say static friction maximum is equals to, here we will apply the one we can say coefficient of static friction, that is a mu s, and here normal reaction. So this is finding for the formula for finding the maximum value of static friction. We cannot find the exact value of static friction, but we can find the maximum value of static friction. Now here one point comes that if suppose that if applied force, here I applied this is denoted as the applied force is greater than the static friction force maximum force, then the body will be, the body moves, then the body moves. If applied force is greater than the maximum static friction force, then the body will move. If applied force is less than the static friction maximum value, then the body will be in the rest, then the body will be in rest. Now what if these both are equal? If applied force and these both are equal, so the body is just started, or we can say tends to it started. So basically this is called the static friction. Basically this is called when these both are the equal, that the body tends to start, it tends to start. So that is called the static friction. In next video we will discussing about the two another types of the external friction, that is the kinetic friction and the limiting friction.